Happy New Year, NK News podcast listeners. Before we start this week's episode, please fill in our listener feedback survey. You can find it at tinyurl.com/nknewspodcast2023, all in lowercase. The link will be in the show notes as well. We need your feedback to continue to improve this podcast. 20 lucky people will be chosen at random to receive a free year's subscription to nknews.org. Once again, the address is tinyurl.com/nknewspodcast2023. Now, on with this week's episode. Hello, podcast listeners. I'm your host, Jacko Zwirko, and today it is Monday, December 18th, 2022. I'm joined here on the Zoom by three members of the NK News and NK Pro team who have recently returned from a trip to Washington, D.C. and New York City. But first, before we begin, please leave a review about this episode on iTunes or whatever platform you use, and share this episode with colleagues, friends, and even enemies, and especially frenemies. And what's more, please like and subscribe. Secondly, check out NK News, where you can find all the in-depth stories written by the excellent journalists that I'll be talking to today. Consider buying a subscription for a year. It's more affordable than you think. In fact, if you sign up for the annual plan, it's less than $1 a day, which helps to fund all the great work that we're doing here at NK News and NK Pro. Thirdly, follow us on Twitter. You can find each of our handles in the show notes, and nknews.org, one word, is a general Twitter account for the entire platform. Now, to introduce our three guests today, freshly back from America, we have my colleagues and roundtable veterans, Chad O'Carroll, Jeongmin Kim, and Colin Zwirko. Thank you all for joining me on the podcast today.
Morning.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Probably the last one that we'll record for this year. Okay, so let's talk about your recent trip to the US, specifically to Washington, D.C. and New York City. First, I've got to say, I'm really jealous. I enjoyed my trip to those cities in January 2020, just as COVID was beginning, and I look forward to going there again one day in the future. Well done on getting the trip out there.
Yeah, it's been the first trip we've done since the pandemic. You know, we used to do these big events in DC where we could justify bringing large numbers of people there, but sadly, those events are on ice, the big ones that we used to do in different cities, hence the smaller team that went this time.
I do hope they come back. Chad, what was the main purpose of this trip?
The main purpose was really twofold. Number one, to meet existing and potential clients of our service. So NK Pro is the platform that we've built for professionals who work on North Korea. And there are many institutional subscribers within the US government, US think tank community, military, business, corporate sectors. And so we wanted to just check in with a few of our long-term readers in the NK Pro sphere, and also to meet and learn from people working on North Korea policy in Washington, D.C. and in New York City to see what's on their mind and try and understand from them what's going on. And in that regard, we also did our first ever networking event, evening networking event in DC, where we put together, I know we brought together some like 60 or 70 people who are like working on North Korea right across the board, but with a lot of younger folk as well, because not to be cliched, they are where the future is.
Yes, exactly, and well done on that. Did you find out if any of them or all of them are already listeners to the NK News podcast?
Yeah, some of them definitely listen to the podcast. I had a few people come up to me who have been interviewed on the podcast, or who want to be interviewed on the podcast, or who listen to it. So podcast seems to be popular in DC.
Asking the important questions.
Yeah, you've got to ask the important ones. Did you each have individual separate missions to meet certain people or achieve certain goals?
Well, just quickly, I met a few people on the side, people I haven't seen for a few years from DC, but Jeongmin, Colin?
Yeah, I did a separate presentation talking about satellite imagery for KEI, and the other two did some separate event that I was not a part of as well.
And have any published stories come out of this trip?
No, we weren't. We had, I think, like 8 presentations if memory serves, over
Wow.
the week. So it was, yeah, and like the calendar was pretty killer. So we didn't have time for writing, unfortunately.
Yeah, and our friend and colleague Dr. Andrei Lankov was with you as well, wasn't he?
He was, yeah. He went out a few days earlier and introduced us to some great bagel shops in various places. Yeah, he was good to have in all the meetings. It's really he has so much long-term insight and context on everything, and I
Yeah.
think it's really good for us who are all like less experienced to have that kind of experience with us in the room, so that when there are difficult questions, we can throw them to him.
Yeah, it's a pity he can't be here on the podcast today, but he sends his apologies to our listeners. So, Chad, as you mentioned, this is the first NK News team visit to the east of the United States since our last trip in January 2020. What's the value of taking trips like this?
Well, I think obviously we've been in a Zoom overkill for the last 2-3 years, and with that, there has been very limited ability to just interact with people, especially to meet new people. And events and conferences are really good for networking, meeting new people. And also, of course, when you're going to meet people face to face, they're much more willing to share stuff that they would be hesitation doing online. So, we got to learn from people about what they, I guess, quote unquote, really think on some of the issues, which was quite interesting when it came to some of the government folks we met. But yeah, I thought that's the main value and continues to be the main value in doing stuff in person.
Right. Any comments there at all, Jeongmin or Colin?
It was also the first time since the Biden administration and the Yoon Suk-yeol administration in South Korea inaugurated that we visited the DC. We monitor a lot of things going on in South Korea on a day-to-day basis, but it's difficult to see what the actual vibe is in DC unless you visit the place, because it's very different talking to people off record in the room or just via email or call and Zoom. So yeah, it enables us to go into more in-depth discussions about policy lines and defense goals and so on and so forth.
And how has the general mood changed from the Trump administration to the Biden administration? And I don't want to talk specifically on Korean affairs yet. I'm just talking about the general vibe, the general mood.
I guess that people are, well, no, it's not a guess. People are, I think, like the stability that's come back to governance. We've met people that worked under, and some of the meetings, I think it was one meeting in particular, we heard about people being kind of blindsided by some of the things Trump would tweet directly relating to this person's professional beat and what their area of government focuses on. And so, when Trump was president, if you'd be working hard and diligently on things, and then sometimes he could just override your work with his public utterances, or on the contrary, cause lots of weekend work for you by stating that something is pending when it might not be. That's one example I can think of where there was, I'd say, a sigh of relief from some people, that things have returned to normal, quote unquote, and become more predictable.
Right. And also not just after Trump, but after pandemic, I could see that the general ambiance in DC offices changed a lot. I personally visited CSIS to see my old colleagues, and I think only half of them were there. I think a lot of people are still teleworking in DC, and I heard that Mondays and Fridays people are usually just working from home, and it seems like there are less and less space for personal interactions, it seems. So us gathering people together, I could see that people were really enjoying it.
I would just add on that, I think that was one of the biggest things I felt from the trip was the whole event and conference area has changed so much in the 2-3 years we've been away. Like, I remember when we were there before, we would get 80, 90 people showing up to events, and now it's like 10 or 11. And the reason, but then the thing is, when you meet people in other meetings, they're like, oh, I saw you at this X event or Y event, and they're all tuned in online through the hybrid Zoom connections. And it's convenient, but the downside, I think, is it's, face-to-face contact disappears. And especially for young people, there is much less opportunity to be in the room with someone senior. And, I saw people on this trip just a couple of weeks ago that I literally met and introduced myself to at conferences 13 years ago as a young intern. And I just worry that interns are not going to have the same networking opportunities because so many senior people just don't want to go in person anymore. And
I have the same concern.
Yeah.
Now, Colin, what about in Korean affairs? Did you notice a significant changing of the guard having taken place under the new administration or a major policy review?
Well, I didn't do many of these meetings during the Trump administration, so I don't really have much to compare to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Chad, Jeongmin, have you got any comments on that?
Just to reiterate what I said earlier, I mean, I think the main thing I can compare is the level of predictability is restored. But, you know, one thing that's definitely clear is a huge difference is the level of priority is just not there. It's so clear that North Korea is just on the back burner right now from multiple parts of government and indeed the think tank industry. And, you know, I remember being there in 2017, having like coffees with sources in Starbucks, and there was so much going on. There were North Korean officials coming to DC. There were, you know, senior like delegations from North Korea coming to New York City. There was definitely a sense of excitement and curiosity. And I remember people were asking me like, oh, what do you know about this ambassador? He's going to be in DC next week. Can you tell, we need to prepare a gift for him. Have you got any like stuff like that is just not obviously happening anymore. And yeah.
Usually when a new president comes in, they tend to do a policy review of things like Korea, North Korea, Korean affairs, denuclearization, etc. Did you notice the effects of that much?
The policy review?
Yeah.
Well, the policy review, I mean, as we've discussed on this podcast, seems to me at least to just be strategic patience 2.0, a few changes here and there.
Right.
So I guess it's doing what it's meant to do, which is not make things a priority relating to DPRK.
And is Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine having any noticeable effects on the foreign policy community's attention paid to North Korea and Korean affairs more broadly?
Yeah, I think so. Also, the increasing authoritarianism in China as well, along with the Russian-Ukraine war, the two topics came up a lot during our discussions on North Korea. And just to get back to your question before, Jacko, as well, I was in DC in 2017 as well during the Fire and Fury. And actually, a lot of the discussions that we had were about the escalation cycle recently, like North Korea firing missiles and artillery shells and so on and so forth. But it seems like, linking to what Chad said, because it's a bit deprioritized, it seemed like people do understand that there is an increased level of military activity from North Korea, but the sense of urgency, it seems, it actually decreased, thinking about North Korea. And I think that the reasons include the world seeing what appears to many people more urgent things like Russia actually threatening to use the nuclear weapons and something like that.
It could also be just the case of the law of diminishing returns, right? That as North Korea fires more missiles, it actually gets less attention rather than more.
Well, it could be part of that. In 2017, I was in DC when there was a whole noise about whether or not North Korea will fire an ICBM. And it was actually a big deal at the time. But now it's not, one ICBM is not a thing, you know, not a big headline anymore. So a lot of people were talking about when's going to be the next nuclear weapons test. But the cause and the reason and the, you know, preparations for when North Korea actually does the nuclear weapons, I think it was really different from when it was in the 6th nuclear weapons test.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I don't know, maybe one of you can speak to what the hidden understanding was back in 2017 regarding how much of a nuclear state North Korea really is in reality. But that was definitely the mood this time was, of course, denuclearization is not a realistic goal, but it has to continue to be the policy, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just add on one more thing?
Please.
So the nuclear weapons possession thing, I think North Korea may have gained what it wanted in the past few years a little bit, because in 2017, it was more like the normative sense, the should sense of we should not let North Korea nuclearize was much stronger.
Yeah.
But now it seems like the discussion is definitely sort of moving on towards, is North Korea already a nuclear state or not? Although many of them are still a shush discussion, I think the sense of, is it time to really recognize it as such, or are there risks attached to that? I think that discussion has definitely risen in DC.
But I don't think I heard any evidence of there being a discussion of recognition, of official recognition.
No. It's not like we are trying to recognize it. When I'm saying they, it's not the U.S. government officials. It's just DC people in general. I think that topic was not there before. It wasn't a matter of discussion even at the time, I think.
So as Colin reminded us, the complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea is still the stated policy of the United States. Is it actually believed in, or did you get the sense that people are paying lip service to it?
I think there's still a belief that has to be the policy. And I mean, that's the part that you have to compare, is how much belief was there in the possibility of achieving that goal back in 2018, really behind the scenes as part of someone who wanted a big deal at Hanoi, for example. How much did they really expect to see that happen down the line? But yeah, I think there's still a belief that if you can get them to the table, then you can start talking about steps towards denuclearization. I don't know how much a belief survives in that eventually happening.
Chad, what's your sense of it?
Yeah, I think Colin's right that people still feel like there's no practical alternative but to continue pursuing the goal of denuclearization, even though they know in practice it's not going to go anywhere, simply because of the other consequences and how big US government is. Like that, even if this was considered a small, a smart step by those with expertise on North Korea, that just turning around this like oil tanker behemoth of US government to accommodate this is just be so difficult. But what I guess was also interesting, we touched upon a little bit in one of the meetings, what if South Korea goes nuclear? And that's something, as you know, that's got increasing momentum here. But the message I sort of understood was, no, we can't let that happen. But I don't know, again, is that just wishful thinking, or are we going to see the US? I highly doubt this. If South Korea goes that way, are we going to see the US leveling massive sanctions on the ROK in the same way that they did to DPRK? I just can't see that happening.
We've had some commentators on this podcast in the last year saying that the war on Ukraine is sort of the final nail in the coffin to North Korean denuclearization, that North Korea will never give up its nukes, if that were ever possible, given what's happened with Ukraine. Have you heard people saying that? Any of your think tank contacts or government contacts suggesting that when you were there?
I think that's kind of an outdated narrative. I mean, I didn't hear people volunteering that sort of narrative. It's well known that North Korea has to have security guarantees, whether that's through its own nuclear weapons or by somehow becoming an ally of the United States. And that's a whole other hypothetical. So
I'm just curious, what do you mean by it being an outdated narrative, that the Ukraine war was the nail in the coffin to denuclearization of North Korea? Well,
anyone who has in the last few years suggested that North Korea could give up their own security guarantees for some promise on a piece of paper, I think even though that's been an official line, it's not really too serious of an argument. So just by saying, oh, hey, Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons that was on their territory in exchange for security guarantees, and they saw that go out the window, that's the thing that convinced Kim Jong-un not to do it. I don't think there's a straight line between the two. But, I didn't really hear that talked about, and that was the question. So,
yep. So how is the think tank scene there in Washington and New York? Has that been changed by the arrival of new players, for example, the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, or has there been a big change in lineup from prominent former Trump administration members joining the think tank world?
Well, we didn't meet Quincy Institute people. I did reach out to them, I think, but we didn't really go to any think tanks except, I think, we went to Brookings, KEI, and Jeongmin went to CSIS, and we also went to Korea Society in New York. I mean, for me, just the huge difference, like we've already discussed, is just the hybrid event thing is just killing a large part of what I associate think tank life with in DC. Yeah. And for me, what's so odd is that A, we're not feeling that in Seoul. People still like regularly pack out events here. Yeah. And B, the paradox is in DC, when we hosted an evening event with NCNK. It was completely packed, and we did a networking happy hour thing, and it was really busy as well. So people, the idea that people can't get off their chairs to go to events is inaccurate. Networking things can draw people together, or evening-based things, but for some reason the daytime stuff is just not working. And I think
that's interesting.
bad.
Interesting choices being made there.
Yeah.
Also, there were free pizza and alcohol at our happy hour, and Chad was bartending. So
Oh, that always brings
it's
the
been a little
people
bit
in,
of a
doesn't it?
factor.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and also about the think tanks, I didn't go to many enough to say this and just in general, but I did hear from a couple of people that there is definitely an relatively increased attention on South Korea, not just North Korea, in the think tank scene in DC in the past couple of years. With the rising indifference towards North Korea's activities and South Korea gaining more attention in the policy scene.
Right. That's also is that perhaps a knock-on effect of South Korea's increasing soft power and cultural commercial value?
Yeah, that could be part of it, but probably not just everything. But yeah, I think it's a relative factor. I think North Korea, when people thought about Korea in DC, I think it was mostly North Korea at the time, thinking about the military tension and so on and so forth. But now when we think about Korea, it's not just about military, but it's also about, like you said, soft power, but also econ. South Korea is part of IPEF and other regional forums as well. So I think
Remind us again what IPEF is?
Oh, it's an Indo-Pacific Economic Forum led by the U.S.
Okay.
One other thing I'd like to add that is actually a big difference from years past is one of the interlocutors I spoke to within the think tank community said that as a result of some trends, I believe, that started building momentum in the Trump administration, there's much more scrutiny over what foreign funders, government funders are doing when it comes to think tank activities. So some think tanks now categorically in DC refuse to accept money from governments, including the South Korean government, which means that certain programs on the careers in certain think tanks are totally disconnected, which I think is a good thing, but it probably means they have less resources. The other knock-on effect of this, which was really interesting, is that there's apparently some limitations on how many government officials from the South Korean embassy or from South Korean government think tanks or directly funded institutions in DC can attend events lest it look too much like foreign influence or interference. And I know this isn't just Korea specific, but it's something that has been growing across the board. Lots of people have been wondering why some of these big think tanks have been receiving like huge amounts of money from Gulf states, for example, who are not particularly well known for freedom and democracy. But it probably means there's some painful decision making going on in some of these institutions regarding the scale of projects, which could have probably been much better funded in the past. But I think it's probably a good thing in the long term.
When you say increased scrutiny of think tanks that receiving money from overseas, what does that look like?
Well, one example in the public domain is there have been, I think it was the New York Times did a pretty thorough investigation into this a few years ago. And I think some congressional offices subsequently got worried about what level of interference there is. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was working in a think tank in DC, not on Korea, back in 2010 or 11. And we were focusing on a project on Africa. And there was an area in Morocco, just south of Morocco, that's, if you look on Google Maps, there's this kind of country that Morocco doesn't recognize. Western Sahara. And the Moroccan government was funding the project somehow. And we were doing a think tank report. And on the maps that we published in the report, we were not allowed to refer to that country. And there was a whole load of and so that is clearly unacceptable. A funder shouldn't be able to do that. So there are definitely examples out there, and I think it's right that people pay more attention to the strings that come with some of this money. But it's something that's like global. It's not Korea specific, but there will obviously, Korea issues in DC have been very, very heavily funded by Korean corporations or government-related entities, and so I think there's probably quite a big vulnerability there if there is to be a lot of question marks on that funding.
Now, you mentioned earlier, Chad, that people aren't coming to a lot of daytime conferences, although they are more willing to attend the evening networking events. On the other hand, since COVID restrictions in Korea were loosened earlier this year, we now see a lot more people from the United States, particularly from the East Coast, resuming their regular trips out here to Seoul. Do you feel like things are back to normal, or do you still meet people who are unaware of what's happening here and wanted to pick your brains about what's going on the peninsula?
Yeah, so there's definitely things are getting back to normal, but maybe too much, because one thing we heard repeatedly when we were in DC was that there were so many Korea events on that single week. I think like 9 or 10.
Wow.
There was tons of delegations in town. Like I think KDI were doing something. KEI were doing their annual opinion leaders seminar, which is flying in tons of experts from Korea. There was the Che Institute had just done something out in Virginia in a fancy hotel. There was lots of stuff going on simultaneously. So it may be that one effect of the COVID like stuff drawing down is that we're just seeing a huge uptick in activity, and that may actually be diluting the impact or reach of everyone. But yeah, it's still interesting to me that people in Seoul are much, much more willing to come in person. We get full houses for every event we do, more or less. And then in DC, it's just so small.
Can you share anything interesting tidbits from your meetings or networking events?
Well, one thing I wanted to say, which I thought was interesting, I had a conversation with one gentleman who I think would be much more supportive of Yoon than of Moon Jae-in. And this person said he was very concerned about the Yoon administration's pursuit of Sahun in particular. Said they were deeply troubled by this, and Sahun is a very fine North Korea watcher, expert, and I was interested to hear that some people in DC are paying attention to the fact that this kind of activity is going on with so much energy.
Jeongmin?
Yeah, that's in line with what I said before about a lot of attention on South Korea. It's actually a very detailed attention on like political move in South Korea, basically. Sometimes that are not directly linked to North Korea. Seoul obviously is, but
Just for our listeners there, that's to remind our listeners, the investigation into Seoul is about more broadly is about the what happened to the South Korean fisheries ministry official who ended up in the water and was shot, and his body was set on fire by North Korean soldiers a few years ago.
And
yes.
To clarify, that's the Yoon administration going after the former,
National Security Advisor?
Yeah, who was in charge at the time. Just right. I didn't hear that was clarified. So
yeah, so not just about Seoul, but also I heard multiple times, actually a lot of times, where people pinpointed to a very specific, detailed remarks from the South Korean high-level official or the president in like related to North Korea and not related to North Korea. For example, right before some of our meetings, President Moon said something about how the labor strike in South Korea is similar to North Korean nuclear threat. And there were a lot of people asking me to clarify what he meant by that. There were some people who were talking about why Yoon ends up talking about North Korea in a very escalatory manner sometimes. So it seemed like there are a lot of very intense attention on every South Korean moves these days, it seems.
Interesting. Colin, are you able to share anything?
Interesting tidbits?
Yeah.
Oh, man. There were some interesting tidbits, but I don't think I can talk about.
I can maybe jog your memory, and this is something we might all mention. Three things. One is we met a lot of people talking about sanctions, and some actually surprisingly were pragmatic about the diminishing role of sanctions. And two,
exactly. Yeah.
A lot of interest in overseas workers and cyber. So, Colin.
Well, yeah, they mentioned those things. I don't know what I can say without giving away who said those things.
Well, I mean, what surprised me is I think in several conversations we had on sanctions, people were, I was expecting in some conversations for people to be very hawkish on sanctions and obsessive about minutiae. Yeah. And I was pleasantly surprised that people were not like that, and that there is genuine recognition that some of those very minutia style sanctions are performative and don't really have any real effect. And yeah, go on.
I guess in general, there's an open question on the topic of sanctions about how to deal with the main problem right now, which is recognized as North Korea's ability to, I guess, gain funds through things like cyber attacks and other cyber methods, which is all very complicated and over my head. But being able to accomplish these attacks or gain money, maybe through some kind of cryptocurrency, and then turn that into real money that they can use out in the world in order to purchase items such as some kind of metals that they might need for their weapons program, or other materials or technology in order to get some kind of technical help on these projects, because obviously they're making a lot of rapid progress on their missile and even aerospace development in the last couple of years. Already, it's pretty difficult to track these cyber attacks and attribute them to North Korea. And then you need to find the actual people that are able to turn this into real money that they can use in the world. And then, so, one method is backtracking from ships that are delivering items into North Korea, who's connected to these ships, who's connected to these transactions. But nailing down specific actors in all of this is proving to be almost impossible, is what we're hearing. So, this is a pretty big problem. And hearing it from the people that know it best in Washington and New York, that's a big one.
Now, in terms of executing or making an executing policy on North Korea, you've got a lot of different actors there in the U.S. government. You've got, of course, the Department of State, but also the Department of Defense and the Department of Treasury and the White House. And can you tell us anything about how these actors all coordinate and communicate with each other? Are they working at cross purposes? Does the left hand know what the right hand is doing?
I think there's a pretty consistent focus on things like on North Korea's emerging cyber capabilities. I don't think we can speak to how well any actors are connected on that front, but just to reiterate, it's basically a question of how North Korea is able to launder money in ways that are more difficult to track than before the cyber and crypto era.
Yeah. Chad or Jeongmin, have you got any thoughts on that, on ways that the government actors work together or don't?
Yeah, not really in detail from me.
Well, not between government entities, but within, even linking to cyber, it seems like it could be potentially a bit difficult going forward, because it seems like the people who usually handle North Korea portfolio, who are some also in rotation, they are not usually cyber experts. So it seemed like there were a lot of cooperation between different departments, not just North Korea department, but with other experts in the government entity. So it seems like the communication became a little bit more complicated when it comes to cyber activities and sanctioning North Korea.
Right, and that'll probably continue as we expect cyber activity by North Korea to continue to grow, right?
Probably, yeah.
Now, North Korea, of course, has a number of diplomats who have been stuck in New York City since the pandemic began, and they make up the DPRK's permanent mission to the United Nations. Were you able to visit them while you were in Manhattan? Did you get a sense of how they're doing or how active they are?
I went for a jog by the mission to see if I might be able to bump into anyone, but I didn't see anyone. But
Chad was loitering near the building.
They weren't out there buying bagels at nearby delis?
No, well, they might have been, but I was loitering like a creep outside.
Chad, you should bring a flag next time.
Bring a flag.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I understand from good authority that they are still not meeting people in the United States outside of the UN system that they're directly there to work within.
Wow.
That's been like that since February 2019 when the Hanoi summit fell apart. So I guess that's going to be 4 years in February next year.
Yes.
Quite incredible.
Close to 4 very lonely, very quiet years.
Yeah. It's quite something. I don't know when or if that's going to change.
Well, what can we look forward to in the next year in terms of US policy on North and South Korea?
Good question.
Probably the same line continuing again and again, that they're open to dialogue, that denuclearization remains the goal, and probably more sanctions. I guess as we all know, the channel of sanctions at the UN appears pretty dead in terms of even not being
Yeah.
able to enforce existing sanctions. So there are a lot of resolutions on the books that member states are required to enforce. And you know, if you find the panel of experts does all this work to find examples of violations of existing sanctions and then recommends enforcement measures that the country's member states should take. And new designations based on this are not made due to opposition from Russia and China, mostly, I believe. So countries feel like they need to push harder on individual sanctions, what we saw in the last month was kind of, maybe you guys know if this was unique or unprecedented, but some coordinated sanctions from Seoul, Washington, and Japan. Is that correct?
Yes.
And EU.
Yeah, and EU. And they all coordinated what kind of sanctions they were doing and then tried to release memos at the same time on those. So maybe we'll see more of that. And these are the countries that
Wait, do you mean that the sanctions themselves are new, or just the enforcement mechanisms are being renewed?
Well, they operate under their own, they don't operate exactly under existing UN resolutions. So they can sanction whoever they want based on what they deem as illegal being, operating through the US financial system or the other country's financial system. So more of that. And these are the countries that were doing most of the enforcement to begin with anyways. It's kind of unknown how much China and Russia were doing to begin with, even though they were doing some. So more of this type of approach.
Okay. Well, that just about wraps it up. Any final thoughts from each of you before we go?
Yeah, well, it was great to be back with everyone. I have a huge appreciation to all the team members for enduring the ultra long flight, which was quite uncomfortable at times, and working so hard to prepare diligently for lots of great briefings and meetings and presentations. And yeah, generally everything went really smoothly. So hats off to everyone, and Dr. Lankov, who's not with us today.
Yeah, thanks. No one should cry for us just for being able to fly abroad, but
no,
yeah.
I'm still jealous. A lot of fear of missing out there. No tears from Jacko here.
But yeah, we wanna if any listeners in Japan or Singapore would like to host us or work with us in person, we want to reach those two countries before end of Q2 2023. So anytime in the next 3 to 6 months, it'd be great if you want to work with us on some stuff in your country, with your government, with your media. Let us know. It'd be great to do something.
Excellent. All right. Well, that wraps up this episode there. I want to wish all of you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year for 2023.
Merry
Happy
Christmas.
New Year.
Yep.
And thanks for coming on the show, Jeongmin Kim, Chatter Carol, and Colin Zwirko. Ladies and gentlemen, that wraps it up for not only this episode, but also the recording for the year. If you already have an NK News account, and if you're a think tank, business, or academic institution, take a look at our NK Pro platform, which offers unparalleled services specifically catered to the needs of professionals who monitor developments on the Korean Peninsula. Inquire about access at membership@nknews.org today. Thanks, as always, go to Brian Betts and Darius Dare for facilitating this episode, and to our post-recording producer genius, Gabby Magnuson, who cuts out all the extraneous noises, awkward silences, bodily functions, etc. Thanks very much, and we'll hear you in the new year.